Montana Territory, January 1883. The winter had arrived with a vengeance that year, transforming the upper Missouri Valley into a landscape where survival itself became a daily calculation. Temperatures plunged to 28 below zero, and the wind cut through wooden walls like they were made of paper. In small cabins scattered across the frozen wilderness, families burned through cord after cord of precious firewood, yet still woke to ice forming on the inside of their windows. But in one particular cabin, something different was happening. Something that would challenge everything the experienced builders thought they knew about heat and survival. This is the story of how one man's ridiculous modification to a simple stovepipe became the difference between freezing and thriving, and how the mockery he endured turned into the blueprint that would save lives across the frontier. Before we begin, hit that like button and subscribe, because by the end of this story, you'll understand a heating principle that modern homes have completely forgotten. And drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? I read every single one, and your location might just inspire our next frontier story. Now, let's go back to that brutal winter of 1883, when one immigrant's strange construction project was about to prove everyone wrong. William Krauss had arrived in Montana Territory 3 years earlier, carrying little more than a carpenter's tool set and memories of Bavarian winters that had taught him lessons most American builders had never considered. At 42 years old, he'd already survived 2 decades of alpine cold, the kind that killed livestock and tested every theory about shelter and warmth. His neighbors in the small settlement near Fort Benton had welcomed him with the cautious friendliness reserved for all newcomers. He'd built his cabin using local timber, helped raise barns, and earned respect as a capable tradesman. But in the fall of 1882, Willem started a project that transformed that respect into ridicule almost overnight. He was modifying his cast-iron stove, not replacing it, not moving it. He was adding what appeared to be a second chimney, a duplicate stovepipe that ran parallel to the first, both feeding into a shared stone column he'd begun constructing in the corner of his single-room cabin. Willem's building 2 chimneys for 1 stove became the joke that echoed through the trading post and the Sunday gatherings. Guess German engineering means doing everything twice. But it wasn't just casual mockery. The modification seemed to defy basic logic. Every builder knew that a stove needed one clear path for smoke to escape, a single, straight flue that created proper draft. Adding a second pipe that would choke the airflow, fill the cabin with smoke, and waste materials that were hard to come by on the frontier. Willem heard the laughter. He saw the head shaking, and he kept building. The question no one was asking yet, the question that would haunt them through the coming winter, was simple. What did this Bavarian carpenter understand about heat that everyone else had missed? To understand what Willem was building, you have to forget everything modern homes have taught you about heating. In 1883, there was no thermostat, no forced air, no insulation beyond what you could pack between logs. Heat was a precious commodity that most cabins wasted straight up the chimney. Willem's modification started with the stove itself, a standard cast-iron box stove, the kind you'd find in 1,000 frontier cabins. But instead of a single 6-inch stovepipe rising straight through the roof, he'd fabricated a split system. The first pipe, the primary flue, rose about 3 feet from the stove's rear exit, exactly as designed. But then Willem had welded a secondary connection, a second 6-inch pipe that branched off at a carefully calculated angle. This pipe didn't go straight up. Instead, it ran horizontally along the back wall for nearly 8 feet before turning upward. Both pipes fed into what he called his heat tower, a carefully mortared column of river stone and fire clay, standing 7 feet tall and extending 18 inches into the cabin's corner. The stones weren't decorative. They were sandstone and granite, selected specifically for their thermal properties, their ability to absorb and hold heat. Inside this stone column, the 2 flue paths merged, but not immediately. The secondary pipe forced the smoke and hot gases to travel an additional 12 feet before exiting through the roof. Those extra 12 feet meant extra time for the heat to transfer from the gases into the stone mass surrounding the pipes. It's a heat exchanger, Willem tried to explain to anyone who'd listen, though that term meant nothing to most frontier builders. The smoke carries energy. Why send it straight to the sky when you can make it work first? The mathematics were elegant. A standard stovepipe released gases at approximately 400 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time those gases traveled through Willem's extended system, they'd cooled to around 200 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning 200 degrees worth of heat had transferred into the stone mass instead of vanishing into the Montana sky. That stone, nearly 4,000 pounds of it, would hold that heat for hours after the fire died down. It was thermal mass in its purest form, a battery made of rock. But to the experienced builders watching him work, it looked like madness wrapped in wasted effort. By late November, Willem's modification was complete, and the criticism reached its peak. Joseph Hendricks, a master mason who'd built chimneys from St. Louis to the Rockies, made the journey specifically to see Willem's contraption. He stood in the cabin for less than 5 minutes before delivering his verdict. "You've choked your draft," Hendricks announced, loud enough for the small crowd gathered outside to hear. "That horizontal run will trap creosote, create backdraft, and smoke you out of your own home. And that stone column? Dead weight. Heat rises Krauss. It doesn't sit in rocks waiting for your permission." The crowd murmured agreement. Several men nodded with the certainty of those who'd built dozens of cabins and never needed fancy German theories. Samuel Porter, who operated the settlement's general store and considered himself the voice of practical wisdom, was even more blunt. "You've got 2 weeks before the real cold hits. When that stove starts pouring smoke into your cabin instead of heat, don't come crying for help." Some lessons are learned the hard way. Even Willem's closest neighbor, a homesteader named Robert Shun who'd emigrated from Canton and understood something about being dismissed for foreign ideas, felt compelled to voice concern. "My friend, I respect your skills, but I've survived 5 winters here. The old ways work. Why risk your family on experiment?" Willem didn't have a family. His wife had died of cholera on the journey west, but Shin's point reflected the consensus. This wasn't the time or place for innovation. Winter on a Montana frontier was a test of survival, not creativity. The mockery cut deeper when the first fire test produced exactly the problem Hendricks had predicted: smoke. The initial lighting created backdraft in the secondary flue, filling the cabin with thick, choking haze. Willem spent 2 hours adjusting dampers and cleaning joints before achieving proper flow. "Told you," became the chorus. 2 chimneys for 1 stove, what kind of fool? But Willem made his adjustments. He refined the damper positions. And he waited for the one judge that couldn't be argued with: winter itself. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, hit that like button and subscribe, because the next chapter is where everything changes. Drop a comment. Have you ever been laughed at for an idea that later proved right? Let's hear your stories. The temperature was dropping. The real test was coming. December arrived with temperatures that made the early season cold feel like practice. On December 18th, 1883, the thermometer outside Willem's cabin read 31 degrees below zero at dawn. By evening, it had dropped to 34 below. This was killing weather, the kind that found every gap in your walls, every weakness in your preparation. Across the settlement, families huddled near stoves that glowed red-hot, burning through wood at terrifying rates just to maintain 50 degrees inside their cabins. Children slept in layers of wool, close to the fire, while parents took turns through the night feeding the flames. The test wasn't planned. It was simply reality asserting itself. Robert Shun, Willem's skeptical neighbor, was burning a cord of wood every 4 days. His cabin, well built by frontier standards with proper chinking and a tight roof, maintained an interior temperature of about 48 degrees when the stove ran hard. When the fire died to coals overnight, the temperature would plummet to the low 30s by dawn. Samuel Porter's store, which doubled as his residence, stayed warmer due to the large central stove, but the cost of burning nearly 6 logs an hour during peak cold. "I'm going through winter stores like it's kindling," he complained to anyone who'd listen. And Willem's cabin? That's where the numbers started defying expectation. On that same brutal night of December 18th, with 34 below zero outside, Willem loaded his stove at 8 p.m. with 4 medium logs, about 40 pounds of split pine. He adjusted his dampers to the configuration he'd calibrated over the previous weeks. And then he did something that seemed insane to anyone who knew frontier survival. He went to sleep without planning to reload. By midnight, the fire had burned down to embers. The stove's firebox showed only the faint red glow of dying coals. In any normal cabin, this was when the temperature started its overnight collapse. But Willem's stone column, those 4,000 pounds of carefully selected river rock, had been absorbing heat for 4 straight hours. The extended flue path had forced the hot gases to surrender their energy into the thermal mass. Now, as the fire died, that stored heat began radiating back into the cabin. At 2 a.m., when Chin's cabin had dropped to 35 degrees and he was awake loading more wood, Willem's cabin registered 68 degrees on the mercury thermometer hanging near his bed. At 5 a.m., when Porter was stoking his third reload of the night to bring his store back above 45 degrees, Willem's cabin still measured 61 degrees, and Willem was sleeping soundly under a single blanket. The fire had been out for 5 hours. Yet the cabin remained 42 degrees warmer than his neighbor's actively heated space, and nearly 30 degrees warmer than it would have been with a standard stove setup. When Willem emerged at dawn to check his livestock, the settlement noticed something they couldn't explain. No smoke from his chimney. No fire. Yet when Chin stopped by, partly concerned, partly curious, and put his hand against Willem's cabin wall, he felt radiant warmth still emanating from the stone column inside. "How was your cabin warm?" Chin asked, genuinely puzzled. "Your fire's out." Willem smiled, tired but vindicated. "The fire's out," he agreed. "But the heat is still working." The numbers were undeniable. The mockery was about to become silence. Word spread faster than wildfire through frozen timber. By December 20th, nearly every resident of the settlement had found an excuse to walk past Willem's cabin, to feel that radiating warmth coming from walls that should have been cold as stone. Joseph Hendricks, the master mason who'd condemned the design as deadweight, arrived with a notebook and measuring tape. He wasn't there to apologize, not yet, but he was there to understand. What he documented over the next 3 days would challenge 2 decades of his professional certainty. The measurements were systematic and brutal in their clarity. Wood consumption. Willem's cabin used approximately 18 pounds of firewood per 12-hour heating cycle. Robert Chin's identical-sized cabin, using a conventional stove and straight flue, consumed 48 pounds for the same period, nearly 3 times more fuel for inferior results. Temperature retention. After a fire burned out completely, Willem's cabin lost only 2 to 3 degrees per hour for the first 6 hours, then 4 to 5 degrees for the next 6. A standard cabin with comparable insulation lost 8 to 10 degrees in the first hour alone, plummeting to near-outside temperatures within 4 hours of the fire dying. Radiant heat distribution. This was the revelation that stunned Hendricks. Using a series of thermometers placed at different heights and distances from the heat source, he discovered that Willem's stone column created what he described in his notes as uncommonly even heat. At floor level, 64 degrees Fahrenheit. At chest height, 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Near the ceiling, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. In Chin's cabin, those same measurements showed the classic problem of convection-only heating. 48 degrees Fahrenheit at floor level, 52 degrees Fahrenheit at chest height, and 71 degrees Fahrenheit pooling uselessly against the ceiling rafters. "The stone radiates in all directions," Hendricks wrote, his pencil moving quickly across the page. "The extended flue path creates what amounts to a heat transfer chamber. The smoke that exits through the roof carries perhaps 30% of the combustion energy. The other 70% has been captured by the thermal mass." But the most striking number, the one that would be repeated in trading posts and homesteads for years, was that 42-degree difference. On the night of December 22nd, with outside temperatures at 29 below zero, simultaneous measurements were taken at 3 a.m. in both cabins. Chin's fire had been stoked an hour earlier and was burning actively. Willem's had been out since 10 p.m., 5 hours of no combustion. Chin's interior temperature, 47 degrees Fahrenheit, achieved through active burning. Willem's interior temperature, 89 degrees Fahrenheit, achieved through stored thermal energy alone. The difference, 42 degrees. 42 degrees of warmth that existed not because of current fire, but because the system had been designed to capture and hold what other cabins sent up the chimney. Samuel Porter, standing in Willem's cabin that night with a dozen other witnesses, finally spoke the words that the community had been avoiding. "We called you a fool." Turns out the fools were looking in a mirror. The physics weren't complicated once you understood them. Fire produces heat through combustion, rapid oxidation, creating temperatures of 800 to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the firebox. In a standard setup, exhaust gases exit at 400 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying enormous amounts of energy straight into the atmosphere. That's energy you've paid for with labor, cutting, splitting, hauling, stacking wood, only to send it skyward. Willem's secondary flue changed the equation. By forcing those gases through an additional 12 feet of pipe surrounded by dense stone, he created a heat exchanger. As the gases cooled from 450 degrees Fahrenheit to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, that 250-degree difference didn't vanish. It transferred into the stone mass through conduction. Stone, particularly the granite and sandstone Willem had selected, has a specific heat capacity of about 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. His 4,000-pound column could therefore store approximately 800 BTUs per degree of temperature change. During a 4-hour burn, that mass would absorb tens of thousands of BTUs, energy that would radiate back into the cabin for hours after the flames died. It was thermal mass working exactly as the principles of physics dictated. Not magic, not luck, just engineering that most frontier builders had never considered because they'd never needed to consider it. Hendricks closed his notebook that night with a single sentence that captured the transformation in thinking. This immigrant has built a better mousetrap, and winter has proven it catches more mice. By January 1884, 5 families had asked Willem to help modify their stoves. By February, that number had grown to 17. The design that had been mocked as 2 chimneys for 1 stove was now being called the Krauss system, a phrase spoken with respect, even admiration. The frontier had rendered its verdict, and the verdict was measured in degrees, in cords of wood saved, in children sleeping warm instead of shivering through the night. Spring arrived in 1884 with the usual relief, the thaw, the return of game, the relaxation of survival's daily grip. But something had changed in the small settlement near Fort Benton. The winter had been a teacher, and the lesson had been humility. By April, 23 cabins within a 50-mile radius had incorporated some version of Willem's double flue design. Not all were exact replicas, materials and space varied, but the principle had taken root. Extend the flue path, surround it with thermal mass, capture the heat before it escapes. Joseph Hendricks, the mason who'd initially condemned the design, became its most effective advocate. He'd spent the late winter developing standardized plans for different cabin sizes, calculating optimal stone-to-pipe ratios, testing different rock types for thermal retention. His professional pride had taken a blow, but his intellectual honesty won out. "I built chimneys for 20 years, thinking my only job was moving smoke from point A to point B," he told a gathering at Porter's store that spring. Krauss reminded me that smoke is just heat in motion. If you're letting it escape without working, you're burning your labor for nothing. Robert Chun, Willem's neighbor and initial skeptic, had perhaps the most practical testimonial. "I cut 11 cords of wood last winter. With the new system, I'll need maybe 7. That's a month of labor I get back." That's the difference between scraping by and having margin for error. The mathematics of survival had shifted. In a place where every cord of wood represented days of dangerous work, felling trees in frozen forests, hauling them through snow, splitting frozen timber that could shatter axe handles. A 40% reduction in fuel consumption wasn't just convenient. It was life-changing. But the broader lesson went beyond heating efficiency. The settlement had learned something uncomfortable about the relationship between experience and wisdom, between established practice and innovation. Willem Krauss hadn't invented thermal mass. The principle was ancient. Russian stoves, Korean Ondal systems, Roman hypocausts, civilizations have been using massive stone structures for heat retention for millennia. But American frontier building, in its rush westward, had simplified everything to speed and standardization. The basic box stove with a straight flue worked well enough, so it became the default. Well enough had blinded the builders to much better. Samuel Porter, in one of his more reflective moments, captured the irony. We called ourselves experienced. We called Krauss's ideas foreign foolishness. Turns out experience without curiosity is just repeated mistakes with confidence. The Krauss system spread beyond Montana. By 1886, variations appeared in Wyoming Territory, in Dakota homesteads, even in mining camps in Colorado, where fuel efficiency could mean the difference between profitable operation and bankruptcy. Each adaptation carried Willem's core insight. Heat is too valuable to waste, and stone remembers warmth long after fire forgets. Willem himself never sought fame or profit from the design. He shared his methods freely, helped neighbors with installations, and refused payment beyond meals and friendship. When asked why he didn't patent the system or charge for consultations, his answer was characteristically simple. Winter doesn't care about money. It only respects preparation. If this helps people prepare better, that's payment enough. He lived in that cabin, with that stone column radiating reliable warmth, until his death in 1897 at age 56. The structure stood for another 40 years, housing 3 more families, its thermal mass still performing exactly as Willem had designed it to do. The settlement near Fort Benton eventually grew into a proper town, then faded as railroad routes shifted and economic patterns changed. But in the handful of historical records that survived, Hendrix's notebook, Porter's store ledgers, a brief mention in a territorial surveyor's report, Willem Krauss's name appears with consistent respect. The German who taught us to trap heat is how one 1891 letter describes him, written by a homesteader to family back east. The lesson of that winter of 1883 extended far beyond stove design. It was a reminder that dismissing ideas because they seem strange, or because they come from outsiders, or because they challenge how we've always done it, often reveals not the ignorance of the innovator, but the arrogance of the established. Traditional knowledge, whether from Bavaria or Canton, from Native American building techniques or Russian stove design, wasn't primitive. It was engineering refined by generations of people whose survival depended on getting it right. The frontier needed that wisdom, especially when it didn't recognize it at first glance. Willem Krauss had understood what many American builders had forgotten in their rush westward. Winter is the ultimate engineer's exam, and it grades on results, not reputation. The stone column still mattered more than the mockery. The 42 degrees still mattered more than the doubts. And in the end, the numbers, those beautiful, undeniable numbers, mattered more than anything else. If this story changed how you think about heat, efficiency, and frontier wisdom, do me a favor. Smash the like button and subscribe for more forgotten engineering that modern homes desperately need to remember. And drop a comment below. What's one old-fashioned technique you've discovered that actually works better than the modern version? I read every comment, and your insights might just become our next deep dive into survival wisdom that actually survives scrutiny. The frontier taught us that being laughed at isn't failure. Building something that works while others laugh, that's victory. End of script educational note. This script is presented for historical and educational purposes. Any heating system modification should comply with modern building codes, fire safety standards, and be reviewed by qualified professionals. Historical techniques, while ingenious, should be understood in their context and adapted with contemporary safety knowledge.